Ma'am, it's a mailbox, not the Mona Lisa. Well, it's ugly, and you're fined $5,000. Yeah, that was my warm welcome to the neighborhood. If you've ever had an HOA president who thinks she's the sheriff, judge, and divine ruler of suburbia, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories where karma comes gift-wrapped. Because this particular Karen didn't just fine me for an ugly mailbox, she started a war. Grab your popcorn, because by the end of this story, I won't just own my house, I'll own hers. I still remember the morning that everything started. The sun was barely up, the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, and for once, life felt calm. I had just finished moving into my new house, the one I'd been saving for years to buy, and I stood at the end of the driveway sipping coffee, admiring the simple little things I had waited so long to enjoy. My favorite part was that sturdy oak mailbox standing proudly by the curb. It wasn't fancy, just solid, with a brushed brass handle that caught the light when the sun rose over the street. I had built it myself the week before, stained it the same warm tone as my front door, and sealed it like it was a piece of art. To me, it was a small symbol of finally having something that was mine. Unfortunately, it was also the exact thing that would declare war between me and the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood. I didn't even see her at first. I just heard the click of high heels on pavement, sharp and deliberate, the kind of sound that carries power and judgment. Then she appeared from behind a row of rose bushes, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a clipboard. She had that expression that people get when they're about to say something they know will ruin your day. She looked at my mailbox like it had personally insulted her family. "That," she said, pointing her pen at it, "is not compliant with community standards." I thought she was joking, so I laughed. That was my first mistake. She didn't laugh back. She adjusted her sunglasses, took a photo of my mailbox like she was documenting a crime scene, and started scribbling furiously on her clipboard. She introduced herself as Karen, not a nickname, not a title, just Karen, said with the confidence of a woman who believed her name alone carried authority. She informed me that she was the president of the Homeowners Association, a position she said required her to protect the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. I tried to be polite. I told her I had checked the community guidelines before building it, and that the design met every requirement listed in the handbook. She gave me a tight smile and said the rules had recently been updated, and that my design clashed with the neutral tone of the neighborhood. Then she handed me a letter with the HOA logo printed in bold at the top. It said I had been fined $5,000 for installing a non-approved structure. $5,000. For a mailbox. At first, I thought it was some kind of typo or bad joke, but her expression didn't change. She was dead serious. She said the mailbox violated aesthetic standards, cited a subsection that didn't even exist in the handbook I had read, and warned that additional penalties would follow if I didn't comply within 7 days. I remember just staring at her, trying to process how someone could take a box that held letters so personally. She must have mistaken my silence for submission because she smiled like she'd won some invisible battle. Then she took another photo for her records, turned on her heels, and strutted down the street like a judge leaving the courtroom after sentencing me to suburban exile. When she disappeared around the corner, I looked back at that mailbox. It was just sitting there, harmless and proud, the same as it had been a few minutes earlier, except now it had somehow become the neighborhood's greatest offense. I didn't know whether to laugh or to be angry, so I did both. I sat on the curb, coffee going cold in my hand, and thought about the absurdity of it all. A $5,000 fine over a wooden box with a flag on the side. I told myself she couldn't possibly enforce it, that the HOA had better things to do, that this was all a misunderstanding, but as I would soon learn, Karen never started something she didn't intend to finish. By the following weekend, it was clear that the mailbox incident had grown into something much larger than a single fine. It was as though Karen had converted the quiet street into her own personal stage, and I had been cast as the villain in her neighborhood drama. What began as one ridiculous violation notice had turned into gossip that spread faster than wildfire. I could feel it every time I walked outside. Curtains shifted when I passed by. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as I watered the lawn. It was almost impressive how quickly she had managed to turn the community against me. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I found a folded flyer wedged into my front door handle. It was printed on glossy paper and featured the HOA logo, though it was clearly something Karen had designed herself. The headline read, "Community Aesthetic Emergency," and underneath it was a photo of my mailbox taken from 3 different angles. The text accused me of willful non-compliance and warned that actions like mine threatened to erode the unified character of the neighborhood. It was surreal. I half expected to see a mugshot of myself underneath. By noon, I discovered that every house on the street had received the same flyer. The next few days felt like walking through a silent protest. Neighbors I had spoken to just a week earlier now avoided eye contact. One elderly woman who used to wave when I drove past pulled her dog toward the opposite sidewalk the moment she saw me. I didn't even blame them. Karen had perfected the art of whispering just loud enough to be heard. She told people that I was argumentative, that I'd refused to follow community orders, that I was trying to bring down property values. It sounded ridiculous, but in a place where people's happiness depended on things like matching shutters and properly trimmed hedges, ridiculous rumors carried real weight. One afternoon I was cleaning out my garage when I noticed Karen standing across the street with 2 other HOA board members. She was gesturing toward my property with the same enthusiasm a real estate agent might use when showing off a luxury home. The others nodded along, jotting notes on their clipboards. I could hear fragments of their conversation drifting over the driveway, words like non-conforming, unauthorized alteration, and community integrity. It felt like I was being audited by people who thought they were, saving the world one mailbox at a time. I tried to ignore it at first. I figured if I kept my head down, eventually her obsession would fade. But then came the online campaign. The HOA had a private Facebook group meant for neighborhood updates about lost pets and yard sales. Overnight, Karen transformed it into her personal propaganda machine. She posted photos of my mailbox with captions like, "An example of disregard for our shared standards," and "What happens when homeowners think they're above the rules." The comments section was a carnival of passive-aggressive outrage. Some people demanded that the HOA force me to replace it. Others offered unsolicited design suggestions for what they called a properly neutral mailbox. The only person who seemed unfazed was my next-door neighbor, Tom. He was a quiet guy who worked in IT and kept mostly to himself. But one evening he stopped by while I was grilling dinner. He leaned against the fence and said, "You know, you've become the most interesting thing to happen here in years." He told me he'd lived in the neighborhood for almost a decade, and that Karen had run it like a kingdom for most of that time. "Every new homeowner gets tested," he said. "You just happen to have built the mailbox that broke her sanity." His dry humor was the first thing that made me laugh in days. Still, I couldn't help noticing how much influence she held. The HOA board members treated her like a celebrity, and most of the neighborhood followed her lead. That's when I realized this wasn't just about control, it was about image. Karen had built her identity around being the woman who kept everything perfect. The lawns, the paint colors, the holiday decorations, all of it reflected her need to be seen as the guardian of order. My mailbox wasn't just a violation to her. It was defiance. It was proof that she didn't control everything. What Karen didn't know was that I had started keeping records of everything. Every flyer, every post, every fine. My cousin, who worked in real estate law, offered to look into the HOA's bylaws. He said something that made my stomach drop. She's been filing fees that aren't legally enforceable, and she's been using HOA funds for personal expenses. That's when the story stopped being about a mailbox and started being about something much bigger. Karen thought she was embarrassing me in front of the neighborhood, but without realizing it, she was building the case that would eventually turn her world upside down. I started to understand Karen's behavior the way you start to see the outline of a picture hidden beneath too many layers of paint. At first, it was just little things that didn't add up. I'd see her on her porch late at night, phone pressed to her ear, pacing back and forth in her slippers. She'd stare across the street toward my house, whispering with that sharp, clipped tone of someone who's running out of options but refusing to admit it. During the day, she kept up her usual performance of control, hosting her so-called community check-ins and handing out fresh violation letters like party favors. But there was a nervous energy behind her eyes, something restless and brittle. That's when my cousin called and said, "You might want to sit down for this." He had been digging into the HOA's financials, cross-checking invoices, comparing names, running the kind of background checks only someone in real estate law would think to do. What he found explained everything. The association's account had been hit with multiple irregular withdrawals over the last year. They were listed as maintenance reimbursements, but there were no corresponding receipts or contractor reports. The pattern pointed to one person: Karen. Apparently, the woman who fined me for a non-compliant mailbox was behind on her own mortgage payments. She was diverting HOA funds into her personal account to keep her house from slipping into foreclosure. It turned out that her constant need to enforce rules wasn't about protecting community standards. It was about holding together the illusion that she still had control over her life. I spent an entire evening sitting at my kitchen table staring at the documents my cousin had sent. It felt strange knowing something so big about someone who had made my life miserable. I wasn't angry yet. Mostly, I was stunned. Everything she'd done suddenly made sense, but it also made her hypocrisy impossible to ignore. The fines, the surveillance, the gossip, none of it was about me. It was a smokescreen to distract from her own crumbling situation. While she was busy pretending to be the guardian of neighborhood purity, her house was sinking financially right under her feet. The next morning, I saw her standing in her driveway pretending to talk to a landscaper who wasn't even there. She was on her phone, waving her hand in the air like she was approving some grand renovation project. The neighbors walking their dogs glanced over, impressed by her show of authority, but I could see it for what it was. It was all performance. She was playing the role of the successful woman, keeping the neighborhood flawless, while her real life was falling apart behind closed doors. The only thing more fragile than her finances was her pride. That afternoon, I received another violation letter. This one accused me of trash receptacle non-conformity, because my garbage bins were apparently too colorful for the neighborhood palate. I almost laughed. Here she was, standing on the edge of bankruptcy, still finding time to police my recycling habits. I didn't even bother responding. I paid the fine out of pocket, not because I agreed with it, but because I wanted her to feel comfortable, wanted her to keep thinking she was winning. The less she suspected, the better. By that point, I had started documenting everything, from her late-night porch calls to her new habit of slipping envelopes into her mailbox, addressed to herself from the HOA office. My cousin suggested we might be looking at mail fraud. The more we dug, the more tangled the web became. Karen wasn't just misusing HOA funds. She was using them to pay off someone she owed money to. We found the name of a man listed as a contractor on the association's expenses. He didn't exist in any business directory. The address tied to his invoices was a P.O. box registered to Karen's brother in another state. It was an entire operation built on fake paperwork and fear. I started to feel a strange mixture of pity and determination. On one hand, she was a woman in over her head, clinging to power she never really had. On the other, she had humiliated me, cost me time and money, and turned my life into a neighborhood spectacle. Watching her parade around with that smug smile while secretly drowning in debt was almost poetic. I decided then that I wasn't going to retaliate out of anger. I was going to let her own actions catch up to her. The irony of her situation was too perfect to rush. For the next few weeks, I played the part of the obedient homeowner, fixing small things she claimed were violations, smiling when she passed by, and giving her absolutely nothing to suspect. All the while, I kept adding evidence to the file. Karen thought she had me cornered, but what she didn't know was that the walls were already closing in around her. She had built her little empire on deception, and soon enough, the foundation was going to crack wide open. The day I learned that Karen's house was officially going into foreclosure, the sky looked almost too perfect, like the universe had chosen the weather to make the moment cinematic. My cousin had called early that morning, his voice calm but carrying that subtle edge of amusement that only comes when karma starts to take shape. He explained that the bank had filed the final notice. The house would be listed for auction within 30 days if she couldn't make the payments. I sat at my kitchen table listening, the smell of coffee drifting through the air, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. Not the vengeful kind. Just the quiet sense that maybe justice really did exist in this world, even in the middle of a cul-de-sac where people fought over paint colors. For the next few weeks, I watched Karen's routine change. She still strutted down the street pretending everything was fine, but her perfection was slipping. Her car sat in the driveway longer than usual because she'd let the registration expire. The begonias she used to trim every morning began to wilt, The lights in her windows stayed off most nights, and the flyers about neighborhood compliance that used to appear every few days suddenly stopped. It was like watching a puppet show when someone cuts the strings. The movement was still there, but the life behind it was gone. I didn't rush into action. I let time do the heavy lifting. While she busied herself with pretending nothing was wrong, I quietly began the process of preparing for the auction. My cousin walked me through every legal step, explaining how the bidding would work and how easy it would be to stay anonymous during the process. I was still half convinced it wouldn't actually happen. I kept thinking that someone like Karen would find a way out, that she'd charm her way into another extension or guilt someone into helping her. But then, 2 weeks later, a small white sign appeared in her yard. It was simple, with the bank's logo in the corner and the words, "Foreclosure sale pending." That was the first day she didn't come outside. When the auction day arrived, the room was smaller than I expected, just a handful of bidders, a clerk with a tired voice, and a row of chairs that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. I sat near the back wearing a baseball cap, silent and unremarkable. My cousin had warned me to keep my expression neutral. And I did. When the clerk announced the property address, my pulse started to pound in my ears. Bidding began low and rose quickly, but it was still well below the market value. I raised my card once, then twice. The third time, the other bidder hesitated, looked over his paperwork, and lowered his hand. The clerk repeated the number and asked for any final bids. Silence. The sound of the gavel striking wood felt like the end of a storm. Just like that, the house that had been the symbol of Karen's power became mine. Driving back to the neighborhood that afternoon felt surreal. I passed the familiar street signs, the manicured lawns, and the same row of mailboxes that had started all of this. Karen's house sat quiet, blinds drawn, the once perfect flower beds now patches of dry soil. I parked across the street and just watched for a while. It was strange, the mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. The woman who had fined me, insulted me, and humiliated me was now living in a house I legally owned. A week later, the official papers arrived in the mail. I had expected to feel triumphant, maybe even smug, but instead, it just felt balanced. When I finally told my cousin that I planned to keep her on as a tenant rather than evict her immediately, he laughed and said, "You really believe in poetic justice, don't you?" Maybe I did. I wanted her to experience what it felt like to live under someone else's rules. The same weight of control she had used to bully the entire neighborhood would now press gently on her shoulders, not through cruelty, but through quiet irony. When I walked up her driveway for the first time as the property owner, she came to the door with that familiar, tight smile, clearly trying to read my expression. I handed her the new lease agreement without saying a word. She stared at it, her mouth opening slightly, and for a long moment, she didn't move. I didn't need to say anything. The papers said it all. Karen, the queen of the HOA, the woman who once threatened to fine me out of the neighborhood, was now my tenant. I told her calmly that rent would be due on the 1st of every month, and that I expected her to respect property standards. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. As I walked away, the sound of the wind moving through the empty flower beds filled the silence she left behind. For the first time since the war over my mailbox began, the neighborhood felt peaceful. The weeks that followed were almost unnervingly quiet. The same neighborhood that once buzzed with gossip and judgment now felt still, as though the street itself was holding its breath. Karen kept her distance. She no longer strutted around with her clipboard or ambushed people by their mailboxes. She had become a shadow of the woman who used to rule the homeowners association like a self-appointed monarch. Every morning, I'd see her curtains shift slightly as she peeked out to check if I was outside. Every evening, the porch light of her once immaculate house stayed off. The woman who once fined me for painting my front door the wrong shade of walnut now walked to her car like she was sneaking out of someone else's life. I didn't gloat, at least not openly. There was something more satisfying about the silence itself. The same neighbors who had once whispered about my mailbox scandal now waved again, cautiously at first, then with genuine warmth. Tom from next door even dropped by with a bottle of beer one night and said, "You know, I didn't think I'd live long enough to see Karen humbled." We laughed quietly about it, though neither of us needed to say the obvious. The balance had shifted. For the first time, the neighborhood didn't belong to her anymore. It wasn't long before karma decided to twist the knife a little further. One morning, I woke to the sound of a tow truck rumbling up the street. I walked outside just in time to see a bright yellow vehicle stop right in front of Karen's driveway. A man in a reflective vest jumped out with a clipboard and started taking photos of her luxury sedan. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. The car she loved more than anything else, the one she used to polish in her driveway every Sunday while lecturing others about proper water usage, was about to be repossessed. She rushed outside in a robe, hair messy and eyes wide, demanding that they stop, insisting that there had to be some mistake. The driver pointed to the paperwork and explained calmly that she was 3 months behind on payments and that the bank had already tried to contact her. I stood across the street, leaning on my mailbox, and watched as she pleaded with them. It wasn't joyful to see, but it was undeniably poetic. The same woman who had once made a scene over the color of my mailbox flag was now watching her prized car being lifted off the ground in front of everyone. A few neighbors gathered at their windows, pretending not to stare. But everyone saw. When the tow truck drove off, the sound of the metal chains clinking was the only thing left in the air. After that, Karen stopped trying to maintain appearances. The house stayed dark most nights. The flower beds grew wild, and the for rent sign I placed on the property next door seemed to mock her from across the street. I didn't raise her rent or push her out. I didn't need to. Her pride was doing the work for me. A few weeks later, she sent me an email requesting to terminate her lease early. She said she was relocating to explore new opportunities and thanked me for the understanding and professionalism I had shown. I read the message twice, then smiled. For someone who had spent months tormenting me, she managed to sound almost polite in defeat. The morning she left, I watched quietly as a moving truck pulled into her driveway. There was no spectacle this time, no shouting or posturing. Just a tired woman loading boxes into a truck, keeping her head down. When she drove away, the street felt lighter, as if the tension that had hung over it for so long had finally dissolved. I walked to my mailbox and ran my hand along its smooth wooden surface. It was still standing exactly as I'd built it, sturdy, simple, and unapologetically mine. Later that week, a new family moved into her old house. They had 2 kids who rode their bikes up and down the street, laughing in a way that made the place feel alive again. The mother brought over a plate of cookies and introduced herself, saying how beautiful the neighborhood was and how welcoming everyone seemed. I almost laughed at the irony. For the first time since moving there, I agreed without hesitation. The neighborhood really was beautiful. Sometimes I still think about Karen and wonder where she ended up. Maybe she found another place to manage, another set of rules to enforce. Maybe she learned something about humility. Or maybe she just kept running from one neighborhood to the next, chasing control she could never quite hold on to. Whatever the case, I didn't need to know. I'd already learned everything I needed from her. Control built on fear never lasts, and sooner or later, people reveal who they really are. As I stood at the end of my driveway that evening, watching the sunset reflect off the brass handle of my so-called ugly mailbox, I realized the fight had never been about aesthetics. It was about dignity, and for the first time since I moved in, mine was fully intact. And that, my friends, is how a $5,000 fine turned into a full-blown plot twist, straight out of Poetic Justice. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA tyrant, remember paper trails cut deeper than power trips. Hit that subscribe button for more stories of neighborhood karma served cold. Drop a comment if you've got your own HOA horror story, and never underestimate the power of patience, a good lawyer, and public property records. Until next time, keep your mailboxes sturdy and your neighbors humble.